This is part 3 of Unit 9. Again, we're talking about the Gilded Age, all the problems underneath. Okay, today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the immigrants and some of the problems that they experienced. Now remember, we're going through a second industrial revolution as well, and I also mentioned to you that many of these people that are working in the factories of the second industrial revolution are immigrant people. They're what we call new immigrants. They're people coming from new places. Okay, new immigrants. Generally, some things to know about new immigrants: they come after the Civil War, which is why they're called new rather than old immigrants. But as I also mentioned, they're also different because they come from different parts of the globe. They speak languages other than English. They have different religions, different customs. They look different. They're unskilled. They're poor. So that's what new immigrants is. So you just have to kind of have an idea of what a new immigrant is versus an old immigrant. Basically, if it all boils down to it, new immigrants don't fit in very well. They're very different than the Americans that are here, which leads to some problems because they don't fit in or assimilate very quickly. They don't become Americans, and that leads to a lot of people not liking them. Ellis Island is an immigrant processing station where most of these new immigrants went through. It's located off the coast of New York. Angel Island is the same thing on the west coast off the San Francisco. Both of these are where people would come in, and basically the job of these immigrant processing stations is to find out, are these new immigrants fit to enter the country? Are they healthy? Are they criminals? Do they have plans to help us? Or are they going to be someone that the government has to take care of? Now, estimates go about something like neighborhoods of 94-95% of the immigrants were allowed in. These were very quick screens to see if people were fit. You're just catching the most obvious cases. So most people got in, although some people would get sent back if you were unfit. And maybe you had to be quarantined for a while before you were allowed in to the country. But the purpose of these immigrant processing stations was to see who was fit to enter. Most people were deemed fit, and millions of people were allowed into the country at this time, and that's what allowed the cities to grow quite so quickly. We opened up talking about the city of Chicago. If you read that story at the beginning, it tells you how fast the cities grow, and as you can see on the board, the cities are growing at a much faster rate. We have some experience with that here in Dickinson right now. We know how quickly growing cities creates problems: shortage of housing, lack of infrastructure like sewers and roads and these kinds of things. So the cities are growing tremendously fast, and that leads to a lot of problems, which is why I have here streets paved with gold, ? That's what many immigrants thought again. They thought that America was this land of perfect opportunity. Everyone would like them. You could have a nice home, the home with the picket fence in the front, and everyone would have enough to eat. And basically, people were told by railroad companies and other people that America was almost perfect, and the streets were literally paved with gold. You show up there and your worries are over. And you need to know that that's not the case. You saw the movie Far and Away, many of you, so you kind of have some idea of that. But when they got here, they faced prejudice in the form of nativism. They faced harsh working conditions, harsh living conditions, these types of things. Okay? Where is My America is a famous poem from an immigrant at this time, which basically said, you know, where is America that I thought it would be? I come here and it's smelly and it's dirty and I can't see the sun, and the people are rude to me and the people hate me, and I have to work twice as hard here as I did back home. Where is this America? And so that's kind of a famous little writing about this experience. And this caused many American immigrants, or immigrants to America rather, to give up. Some would go home. Some would take their own lives. Some would just kind of go hopelessly into despair and become homeless people because they couldn't take this harsh reality. It was so different than what they had envisioned that it literally snapped them mentally. And that's kind of important to remember as well. You'll see a little bit more on this on the activity we do in class, but many of these immigrants are living in very horrible, poor conditions called tenements. Tenements are very poor housing apartment complexes for poor people, where you're often very crowded, sleeping 7-8 people to a room, something like that. They're filled with rats, lice, disease, You don't have adequate bathroom facilities. In fact, most of the time, since you couldn't rent out a bathroom, buildings would have one bathroom for the entire apartment building. So people often would go to the bathroom out on the streets. You didn't have garbage collectors at this time usually, so most of the garbage was just thrown out into the streets, and that's what created a lot of the health hazards. So there was a lot of diseases and a lot of things that adversely affected people's health at this time. Those are tenements, and again, you'll see some pictures of that by this guy right here, Jacob Riis, who published a book on How the Other Half Lives, which tried to explain what it was like to be an immigrant and what it was like to live in these tenements. You'll see some examples of his pictures from this book in class and an activity we're going to do. But Jacob Riis is a guy that tries to reform or expose how bad the tenements are with his book, How the Other Half Lives. Nativism, as we've already had this term before, should be reviewed. This is prejudice against immigrants. This was also very strong at the time. You might remember the Know Nothing Party, which was an anti-immigrant party before. Many of the political parties of the day will have planks or part of their ideas about anti-immigrants. Nativism is the idea that America is only for Americans, people born naturally in America, people that had something to do with America being formed and that kind of stuff. So this is another thing that immigrants face constantly, was this nativism. To combat this, they often formed immigrant neighborhoods like Chinatown, Little Italy, Polish Hill, things like that, where people of the same country would kind of band together for safety and protection and a little bit of comfort of home as well. Another group that is targeted or has a hard time other than immigrants is African Americans. There was extreme prejudice against blacks, not only in the South, as you would probably know, but in the North as well. That is called segregation. Segregation is when your society is split into groups based on some category. Could be hair color, could be religion, could be nationality. In this case, segregation is referring to separation of the society between blacks and whites. So make sure you know what segregation is and that our country was segregated at the time. In class, I'll give you some examples of Jim Crow laws, but these are laws that created or enforced segregation. These are laws that said you had to have a separate eating facility for blacks and whites, separate bathrooms, separate schools, separate parts of buses, public transportation in general, whatever. These are laws that created or enforced segregation. They're called Jim Crow laws, and again, we'll have an activity in class that kind of explains these a little bit more. Plessy versus Ferguson is a very famous Supreme Court case. What you need to know about this is this legalized segregation. In other words, it said segregation is okay. Plessy is a guy that took one of the states, I forget the state, it might be Georgia, but I don't know for sure, but he took it to court because they wouldn't let him stay in one of the trains that he paid a ticket for. They said that's not where blacks are allowed. They forced him to go in a less comfortable car, and he took it all the way to the Supreme Court, and he lost. The Supreme Court said it's okay if you have segregation. There's a famous phrase that comes out of this as separate but equal. You can have separate things, but you have to have equal things. So the important thing that Plessy versus Ferguson did is it says segregation is okay, separate but equal. So it legalized it. Another thing that's against blacks at the time is something called a poll tax or a literacy test. A poll tax is a tax to vote, and a literacy test is the test before you can vote. What you mostly need to know is these are examples of what was done to keep blacks from voting at the time. These were things to keep blacks from voting because most blacks couldn't afford to pay money to vote. They were too poor. Remember that sharecropping system that we had studied before, which kept them in a state of poverty. So they couldn't afford to vote. Okay? A literacy test, they would give them very complicated things, oftentimes parts of the Constitution, stuff that were hard to figure out, and if you didn't answer the questions about what it said, you were deemed illiterate and not good enough to vote. So the whole purpose is to keep these black people from using the right they got from the 15th Amendment, which is the right to vote. Now again, this is just men at the time, not women. And so this is part of the racism they found is they had to fight in the South as well. But again, not just the South. The problem with the poll tax and the literacy test is that it kept poor whites from voting and some uneducated whites from voting as well, what we sometimes call poor white trash, or that was the term actually used in the South itself. And so that was an unintended case, so they came up with a way around that for these types of white people called the grandfather clause, which basically said if your grandfather could vote, then the poll tax and the literacy test don't apply to you. You kind of get a get out of jail free card and you can vote anyway. And so if you ever hear the phrase grandfather clause, that's where it comes from. The best example, or I shouldn't say best, but a good example I can give to you is often many of you are hunters in here, and if you were born, say, I can't remember what it is, but like 1966 or something like that, you don't have to take a hunter safety course to apply for a hunting license. You are grandfathered in. That's an example of a modern day grandfather clause, but there are lots of other ones. If you think about it, you can find some too. One of the worst parts of segregation in the South is lynching was very common, and I'll show you some of this in an activity we do in class as well. I won't actually show you lynching, that would be wrong, of course, but I will show you some illustrations of lynching and what it was like. Lynching is when you hang a person, usually hanging, could be other means, but you execute someone accused of a crime. They don't get a trial, they're just accused of a crime, and so you execute them based on the fact that you think they're guilty. And this is usually done by a mob. Doesn't have to be, but it's usually done by a group of people. And this was very, very common in the South. African Americans were lynched at a common or a very frequent rate. Estimates go as high as that if you took the last 25 years of the 1900s, it would average out to be one black person a day was lynched. So this is a pretty big thing. It's not just in the South either. It's more prevalent in the South, especially the Deep South. That's where you have it most often, and there are more violent lynchings in the Deep South, but you'll find it all over the country. Even in North Dakota, there are examples of lynching. And it's not just black people as well. Could be anyone, but it's usually black men. Black men were particularly targeted because white women were told that black men were sexual predators, and black men had one thought on their mind and one thought only, and that's to rape or have sex with a white woman. They're constantly thinking about it. So oftentimes a lynching could be simply a black guy didn't get out of the way fast enough for a white woman as she went down the street, and that would be an excuse to lynch somebody because they were assaulting a white woman. Maybe I made eye contact with a white woman, and she would go home and tell her big brother this black guy was scaring me, and that he'd get some of his buddies together and they'd lynch him. These were all done as fear and intimidation tactics to keep black people in their place and to not fight any of the rules or the Jim Crow laws that were in the South about segregation. These are not always committed by KKK members either. These are often just about anyone. Many of you I know are reading To Kill a Mockingbird. This is kind of in there as well. There's a group that comes to lynch basically the defendant Robinson, and Atticus has to go stand in front of the door and stop them or protect them. This was common in the South, and it happened very frequently. Again, Our Lady Ida Wells also argued against this, or Ida Tarbell, I guess this one is, sorry, I didn't mean to confuse you. Ida Tarbell did a lot of readings about this, so if you come across her on your study guide or in questions, you know what that's referring to. Okay? I guess it is Ida Wells. I misspoke there. I get those two confused a little bit. There's not a lot of Idas in there, but Ida Wells is the one that wrote the articles against lynching here. You can see Ida B. Wells. The last slide here that I want to talk about in part 3 is just a couple of statements to keep in mind. Despite all of these problems of the Gilded Age, and we talked about the problems of labor, we talked about the violence, we talked about the segregation, we talked about the poor treatment of workers, how they lived in housing, and it was dangerous, and the growing gap between the rich, between the poor. But despite all of that caused Mark Twain to call this the Gilded Age, there was some things that happened to create unity amongst the country, which was kind of needed after the Civil War. We have growth of industry, which would put people on a unified pace because we're working for the same company. These companies are important to America's well-being. They're making America wealthy, and they're doing great things, these kind of things. City people all living in these cities, we have common experiences. We could use that to unify us. And, it also would give us certain things to fight for together living in these cities. We could fight for better housing. We could fight for more parks and these sorts of things. So some unity was created as well. It's not all dividing us, even though the gap between the rich and poor is growing. There are some things that bring us together. Some examples are baseball becoming America's pastime. Baseball becomes the most important sport in our country. This develops out of the Civil War. There's some interesting stuff in your book about typical baseball games at the time. I have some questions on your study guide about that. This would be interesting for you to read. Outdoor activities and starting to set aside parks and stuff for future generations becomes extremely important, because we got to get away from our tenements. We got to get away from the working conditions. We got to get good air. We got to get some activities that help us get rid of some of this negative anxiety and some of we got to blow off steam, that kind of stuff. So we have to have, Central Park is a good example of that. New York City has started because of that. So we have to have that. And then finally, amusement parks. Probably many of you are familiar with Boardwalk because of Monopoly, but Atlantic City as well, Coney Island, become places for people to have fun, whether it's not just rich people, I guess. These are common places. People that don't have to have a lot of money can come and enjoy. And of course, the amusement parks are still around today. There's a new series on HBO about the Boardwalk in Atlantic City as well. And so maybe you know this or not, Monopoly, all the pieces are real places that were on Boardwalk or parts of Atlantic City as well. So these are some things that kind of leisure time stuff or stuff that's non-working or business related that are going on in America at the same time. That's important to note as well. So that ends part 3 of Unit 9. When we get to part 4, we're going to start talking about something called the Progressive Era, which is the time period where a lot of people try to reform America and fix a lot of the problems of the Gilded Age.